I just had a word in my ear. It's the mélanger, a nice mixture of where everyone stands. Look, thanks very much indeed for joining us here for this. Let us be known by our deeds, how to scale up transparency and responsible mining supply. So perhaps a quick wave from everyone. Matthew Chamberlain, CEO of London Metals Exchange. Mark Robinson. Mark is the Executive Director for the Extractive Industries Technology Initiative. Inga Petersen. Inga is Executive Director of the Global Battery Alliance. Juan Ignacio Diaz is President and CEO of the International Copper Association. Karim Dahou is the Deputy Director and Head of the China Unit for the OECD's Global Relations and Cooperation Directorate. And Issac Tandoh. Issac is the Executive Officer for the Minerals Commission in Ghana. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. You'll get a sense here, we've got a strong representation from the organizations that are trying to, well, not just trying to, are instigating traceability and transparency across this incredibly complex and diverse sector. Perhaps that's where I'm going to start, because let's cut to the quick. And Mark, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to pick up on a reference you made, actually, which is when we were talking, you spoke very honestly about the lens of political realism that comes to play in what you're doing. There is this urgent need for more demand, certainly more supply, and it's got to come from somewhere, and it's got to come now. And that puts pressures on all of you guys who are trying to establish greater traceability, greater transparency, because suddenly that is not the single most important thing in the room anymore.
Indeed. I mean, the theme of this conference has been urgency and scale, and I think everyone appreciates that. But urgency must not drive out transparency. Urgency means that there will be lots of new actors coming into play, seeing opportunities for fresh investments. Some of those actors may not be familiar with or willing to pursue established transparency standards that have been signed up to by many of the major mining corporations, who are members of the EITI, amongst others. So haste must not displace the urgency and the consistency of the need to focus on transparency. Why is transparency important? Because citizens and policymakers need to know who they're dealing with. They need to know that they're dealing with reputable actors who have legitimacy in the way they function and committed to achieving positive development outcomes as much as seeking good investment opportunities.
Okay, thank you. And I'll come back on one or two of those. Karim, same question for you, really. OECD right at the sort of starting line of establishing these very valuable measures and standards by which all mining companies and jurisdictions should be working towards. Are you on the back foot at the moment? Things have changed. They've changed quite dramatically in terms of need and push, and maybe the environmental elements also have just taken a bit of a backseat over regulation and how much time people are going to spend looking at these things.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say more than the back seat even, because if we need transparency, this is to ensure that mining and more broadly speaking supply chain management is undertaken in a sound manner, in a responsible manner. And the OECD is in fact the guardian of the OECD due diligence guidance on the responsible management of mineral supply chains. It shapes legislation in large consuming countries. It has served as the model for the EU regulation on conflict minerals. It is referenced in the US legislation. So yes, we need transparency to be sure that there is a responsible behavior throughout the value chain. But allow me also to give you a little bit the big picture about why this is becoming ever more important in the landscape of the political economy of critical minerals development. You mentioned that demand is increasing, but the problem is that there are tensions not only on production, but perhaps even more on investment. We need more investment in critical minerals to meet the demand for downstream industries, be it for green electrification, digital devices, defense. And the problem is that the profitability of the business, in particular for the upstream segments of the value chain, extraction, refining, smelters is at stake. There have been dominant positions of a certain number of factors, and there have been a lot of companies that have been crowded out of the business. So we need to de-risk, and we are doing a lot of efforts with OECD members to use a number of mechanisms, blended finance, guarantees, equity injections. There are a number of tools that OECD and G7 countries are developing at the moment, but also we need to invest more, including in risky jurisdictions. In jurisdictions where the governance is not as strong as in OECD context, and even if mining is expanding even in OECD countries. And for that, we really need to ensure that the footprint of mining is better than it had been for decades. And that's why transparency, traceability is of essence. And so we do a lot of work. I mentioned the guidance, which is about for not only mining companies, but big multinationals in downstream industries, ensuring that their inputs are responsibly sourced. But we need also to ensure that this happens throughout the value chain, and we do a lot of work on traceability for that.
Yeah, the work is there, the work's being done, it's implementing it, and it's buying in more support and more, if you like, more adherence to that message. Juan Ignacio, I see that copper prices are up again. They've been rocketing up recently. The drive is there, the need is there, etc. How do you persuade your copper providers that this point of traceability and transparency is the ultimate goal for you?
Well, thank you for the invitation. Interesting question, because what I think that the answer is not in the laws or the regulations or inside the mining companies. The answer to that is dictated by the end users. They are the one dictating how to produce copper. It is the end user, the manufacturing, the OEMs. Those are the people that are saying, guys, I want copper. I want more copper, but I want it circular. I want it available. I want it responsibly produced. I want it with low emissions. And I want it with efficiency. That's the material competition. In the copper industry, we're not alone. So we need to listen to that. And we need to go to our providers and tell them, guys, you need to help us produce this copper in a responsible way, not because we want it only, not because society is demanding it, it's because the end user is demanding it. So we need to sell the way that people want to buy.
But that's the old story, isn't it? The end user's demanding it, but he doesn't want to pay extra for it. So who's going to cover the cost of that? That's
oh, well, you can speak
issue.
with my friend over here. He'll tell you how to charge a little bit more for that. But definitely, the world, the investors and the society are demanding not only more copper, but better copper. And we are absolutely bound towards that way and making great progress.
Inga, this comes at a time, as we've said before, about rolling back of some of maybe the key environmental goals of many minerals producers as well. And you're in a world of battery development, which is, of course, very much about a green transition. How do you stop that roll back in terms of readiness to comply with the needs for your batteries?
Mm-hmm. Thank you also for the invitation to participate in this very relevant conversation. So indeed, we're seeing regulatory simplification in many jurisdictions. I'm not sure we're allowed to call it a rollback. It's under the simplification agenda.
That's a very diplomatic, very nice phrase, regulatory simplification.
Exactly. But ultimately, I think what's generally perceived as a moment of crisis or reckoning, maybe even for the sustainability sector, I think is also a real opportunity. Because before we had much engagement around sustainability as an asset, as a marketing tool, as hopefully a market differentiator, but it wasn't really mainstream into key business decisions, procurement decisions. So what we're seeing now, if our membership is a sort of proxy for that, we cover the entire end-to-end battery value chain, so mining companies, cell manufacturers, OEMs, recyclers. We're seeing really this rallying by companies for whom sustainability is not nice to have, but it's essential as a measure and as a proxy to risk management and resilience. So if you're an automotive OEM and you're procuring nickel, lithium, cobalt, you want to know whether risks, whether it's human rights, indigenous people's rights, biodiversity, whether they're managed properly. so that you have a more resilient supply chain. Because the risk of supply chain disruption is real. We see this all over the world. And it's actually not just in the upstream. You also see social unrest related to construction of battery gigafactories or recycling infrastructure. So it's really spans the entire value chain, this need to have your social license to operate and everything that it entails. So what's been missing from our point of view is how do you translate all these good efforts that are happening upstream and across the value chain to produce more responsibly, to lower your carbon footprint, into a tangible market differentiator when it comes to the end product.
Yeah.
So we're trying to work on that demand side and bridge these efforts. And for us, the key is really in comparability of products and suppliers and in assurance. So are the claims that are being made in relation to a product, to a material, trusted? These credentials that are being passed through the value chain, and traceability is obviously the key enabler to have that information flow also on a quantitative measure. So we're working on issuing product-level sustainability certifications to enable that comparability and market differentiation.
Right, and so as Juan Ignacio pointed out as well, the end user is the critical element if they buy into this process. How much are you seeing that across the world? And I mean, there are certain jurisdictions which are easier for you to work with than others. There are traceability issues which are more perhaps concerning than others. How much of a sort of gradual coming together is there, or is there not?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, if we look at the battery industry, geopolitics has entered this play in a major way due to supply chain concentrations. So this desire to decentralize, to build up regional supply chains is driving more transparency and traceability, with the interest in provenance being the key driver, maybe more than sustainability. But if you establish traceability along the supply chain, you can easily introduce also these sustainability metrics. So we're actually seeing traceability and transparency moving from nice to have to a more of a core requirement. The reasons for that are different in different regions. Indeed, at the moment, I don't think the European market, the end consumer who purchases an EV, is ready to pay a premium for a sustainable battery versus one with no information on these metrics. But where we're seeing real traction is investors, finance, procurement department, including public procurement, who are spending public money to electrify their public transport fleets, bus fleets, for example. So they're really needing that comparability and these harmonized metrics. And I think once we have this buy-in of investors, and we're working, for example, with the World Bank, the IFC is on our board, EBRD is interested in these kinds of metrics. We're hoping it'll trickle through also to private finance, B2B procurement.
Okay, Matthew, if I could bring you in here. I mean, you're part of a similar picture here in terms of the importance of establishing these regulations. You have a certification system at the London Metals Exchange, which has shown that some have dropped off the acceptable list and then found their way back off the naughty step to rejoin. So how do you see this geopolitical shift that we've been working with in the last year or so?
Yeah, I do think it's a fascinating time, and we have the privilege at the LME that in many ways our market is sort of a microcosm of the broader physical market. So we need to have stocks in our warehouses to settle our contract, to drive liquidity, just like the broader physical market needs to have, as you said, David, that supply coming on stream. Yeah, I go back to 2017 when we first implemented the OECD due diligence guidance, and obviously cross-referencing to the EITI guidance as well. And at that point, we had exactly this debate, which is this the right thing for our market? And I think it's all about timeframes. If we'd been planning for the next 1, 2, 3 years, we would never have done that, right? But we need to plan for the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of how our market operates. And in that sense, it was exactly the right thing to do to implement these standards, to make that a base requirement of listing metal on the LME, because in that, over that multi-decade span, absolutely those requirements are there. And indeed, we are going further because we do believe in this, and to follow up on sort of Juan Ignacio's point, it absolutely is the case that there are end consumers who are willing and want to pay a little bit more for that higher quality metal. And so what we're now doing is going to the next step, looking at the initiatives like Coppermark, which is, I think, a very visionary step that the ICA launched, has now been spun out, as you know, into its own entity, Aluminium Stewardship Initiative for aluminium, how we can look at the premium pricing that is attracted by metals meeting those requirements. But I think it's a really important point, and you referenced it. It's about individual consumer behavior, but it's also about security of supply. Because when you look at the G7 work on standards-based markets, where is that coming from? Obviously, there is some interest, some of the G7 members, of having these standards for their own sake. But I think the unifying factor that we see now across the G7 is a realization that no single country can flood the global market with standards-based metal. It is possible to flood the market with low standard metal. It is much harder to flood the global market with standards-based metals. And in that sense, those standards implemented by exchanges, by industry, give you not just that consumer choice, but also that security of supply. And that, I think, is how the debate has evolved, but it certainly hasn't moved away from those core requirements.
You're getting a lot of nodding from Karim there as well, as that's obviously a critical area in which to develop it. Yeah. And you want resource-rich countries to come into the fold, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
But I will come to you in just a second, Karim, but I want to bring in Issac, Tandoh on the end there. Issac, you're from Ghana. You're part of the Minerals Commission there. Can you give us a bit of insight into a resource-rich country that perhaps is looking to move more into these circles? What sort of work are you doing to I don't know if tackle is the right word, but to manage the illegal mining, and I use the word illegal usefully, the informal mining perhaps that takes place in Ghana, and of course which is not coming through the exchequer, it's not coming through the tax take of the government.
Thank you, Dave. So what we've been looking at is to tackle the problem in 4 legs. The first one is the regulatory framework that we're changing to try and address some of these things. One of the things we've done is to look at the licensing regime, which used to be a bit cumbersome for people to acquire licenses to do the right thing. What we've done is we've worked on it to make it easier for people who want to engage in proper mining to be able to acquire the necessary licensing and permitting. What the regulatory regime has also done is to introduce another tier of the mining skill. We used to have the small scale and large scale. There used to be some gray area. You don't know where to place some sizes of mine. Now we've introduced the medium scale, and the medium scale is to bridge between, is to form the bridge between the small scale and the large scale. In that case, you are able to transfer some knowledge, standards from the large scale to the medium scale and scale it down to the small scale. The other thing we have done is to also tackle the importation of excavators into the country. We are tracking every single earth-moving equipment that is entering Ghana. We started that from...
Okay, so just to clarify, so all the earth-moving equipment that comes into Ghana, you know exactly where it's going?
Yes, exactly. So in 2024, excavators were the 3rd highest commodity imported into our country. And you wonder what is happening, because you just have about 19 large mines and a few small-scale mines. So you wonder what was happening. So the first point was to tackle the importation of these excavators. So you need to acquire a permit before you can import. And by the time it gets here, the guys will be ready at the port to put trackers on them and geofence the excavator wherever it's going to work. Once the excavator tries to move out of the geofencing, the engine shuts off. And it costs you a hell lot of money to try and get it back, because I will be charging about 100,000 for that, bringing it back online for you. The third thing we have done is to introduce the responsible cooperative and skills development for this small-scale mining. And that is in 2 tiers. Those who are working in areas that can be formalized, we are putting them under the cooperative. And we are building smaller plants for them. We're working with the World Gold Council to do this. In that case, you can trace every single ounce that is coming from the area. When you pick any dory or any bullion, you know exactly where it's coming from. The other tier is where the guys are not doing the right thing and we cannot formalize them. We give them training. Training in agribusiness, training in building small to medium scale enterprise businesses, and other training for them to be, because if you are moving them, where should they go to? They need to some source of livelihood. So,
but sorry to interrupt you there. Can I ask you then? You know, you have a carrot and you have a stick,
yes.
And I'm wondering which is working more effectively, because here you're talking about almost like a voluntary offer to say, we're going to get you out of this, and we would like to encourage you into a plantation, into that sort of thing. How is that working?
Yeah, so I was coming to the fourth leg. And the fourth leg is the formation of the National Anti-Illegal Mining Operations Secretariat. And those are to enforce and make sure that those who are doing the wrong thing are arrested, prosecuted, and punished appropriately. So if you look at the 4 ways in which we've put this together, ultimately, you will get to a time that you cannot be doing this. We also have the introduction of the gold board, which is to regulate the buying and selling of gold from the small-scale mining sector. It was established by an act of parliament. And what it does is that no one in the small-scale mining space can sell or export gold from Ghana except through the gold board. So what the gold board does is, if you have an off-taker, it brings the forex exchange to gold board. A gold board buys this gold in cedis, and then be able to export whatever the off-taker is buying to them. And so far, the gold board last year bought more than 100 tons of gold, breaking in about $13 billion into the economy. And if you look at it, it's working because the cedi was one of the best performing currencies in the world. Okay. So a time will come with the establishment of the cooperative mining, a time will come. If you go and do the wrong thing, you may not be able to sell the gold. Okay. We are not there yet, but that is where we are getting to.
On the way. Isaac, thanks very much. I know, Mark, for you, and indeed for many of you, bringing in countries from Africa, perhaps in particular, but there are other parts of the world as well, is a big next step and a really important one. I imagine you applaud the sort of efforts that are being made by a bit of a poster child down there within the African continent. But still, issues like traceability are incredibly challenging, as I think, Isaac, you'd probably accept.
Yes, indeed. I mean, half of our 55 member countries are indeed in the African continent, so vitally important. And I know the Ghana experience very well and applaud it, because the gold board experiment and certainly the tracking is a really effective way to keep a close eye on the utilization of licenses intended for artisanal miners, as opposed to larger operators to benefit from it. So I certainly applaud those efforts. I may draw your attention to a forthcoming project that Karim's team and my team are working together on, a major effort to actually combine forces on traceability and accountability in the Great Lakes region, where we see a lot of evidence of movement of minerals illegally, sometimes from illegal mines, sometimes from mines occupied by armed forces or under the control of individual politicians. So there's a real need to ensure that the flow of critical minerals like tin, tantalum, and tungsten, as well as gold, are moving and, well, first of all, produced legitimately, then being exported fairly and benefiting the origin country and communities. That's not currently the case. We know from export figures from some of the countries which are already members of the EITI in the Great Lakes, notably the DRC and Uganda, that there's some very strange figures in terms of the actually stated capacity for production in relation to much greater exports. Yeah. So our multi-stakeholder structure in each country in the Great Lakes members, and we hope to bring in additionally Burundi and Rwanda, will give us a much better hold, working with the OECD and its due diligence guidance and our multi-stakeholder oversight structure in each of those countries to provide a much firmer handle on traceability.
But you remind me there, a lot of this work started with the Great Lakes, and and you're just pointing out that is still a massive issue and a problem. What's your school report looking like? I mean, I'm going to be honest about it. Where are you? Where are you? You're not growing as you should be. You're not developing as you should be. By now, surely we should be further advanced than we are.
I mean, I would nuance this assertion because hadn't we worked with the Great Lakes, DRC would not have had access to mineral supply chains. I mean, we've started the implementation of the guidance 15 years ago, subscribed, developed even with all the countries of the Conference of the Great Lakes region. And this was the condition sine qua non to make sure that those minerals that were traded and got access to value chains were not tainted with human rights violations was the condition sine qua non to access the market. And that's why it was referenced if you wanted to be listed in the US market, in the Dodd-Frank Act, etc. And to my knowledge, it's the only example of OECD work that is referenced in Chapter 7 resolutions of the UN Security Council on the use of force. So there's been implementation. It has allowed to better know what are those minerals that are traded that are not tainted with human rights violations. But this said, I agree completely on the assessment, acknowledgement that there are still a lot of minerals that are traded by warlords or else are illegally crossing borders, and that much more could be done. And we are joining forces precisely for that reason. Just another very quick point.
Briefly,
I want to bounce very briefly on something you said. There are some jurisdictions that are compliant, others less. How do you distinguish? And then Inga said, how do you reward those that are compliant? Really key issue. That's if you want to ensure, that there is more transparency, traceability. At the end, it's to reward those that are behaving responsibly, doing good business. But here you face an issue. At the extractive segment of the value chain, you have jurisdictions like Chile, Juan knows it very well, super compliant on all ESG fronts, etc., and others much less compliant. But then you're faced with this situation whereby for 19 minerals, key minerals out of 20, at the refining stage of the value chain, China has 70% of the market share. That means that you don't distinguish between those minerals, this is in particular true for copper, lithium in Chile, for instance, that are responsibly extracted, and others that come from less compliant jurisdictions. So you are faced with this challenge. Either you have much stronger traceability systems, or you develop parallel supply chains and parallel investment in smelting and in refining. That's the situation G7 countries are facing.
Give us some encouragement then as to how things perhaps are, even within Chinese companies recognizing the value of being part of your alliance.
Yeah.
Or being around the table at least.
Yeah. This concept of standard-based markets, as is captured also in the G7 roadmap, is obviously the direction of travel we all want to go in. But voluntary standards can only take us so far. So we need this anchored in regulation as a condition to market access. And in the case of batteries, the EU battery regulation has requirements on transparency over provenance through the digital product passport, the battery passport. If we roll this back, I don't know how significant the willingness is of some actors to submit to this. So this market access window has been a main driver, especially for Chinese companies to come around the table. And we are fortunate to have them around the table, and they've been extremely productive and constructive in their engagement, participating in operational trials across the value chain. If we don't have a requirement for that transparency, for that proof of standards, I think the picture could look different, because then it becomes a race to the bottom again on cost, especially in the absence of price parity between internal combustion engine and EVs, for example. So yeah, really, really emphasizing that. And I think there is some work to be done in terms of facilitating businesses to prove that standard-based market as well, because you referenced the EU conflict minerals regulation, but it's taken years to recognize a scheme that would actually enable, to showcase compliance. And if the EU battery regulation, for example, follows the same blueprint, we're just using very valuable time to find an efficient model to implement standard-based markets, to prove it, to make it comparable and assured.
Thank you for that. I think, Mark, you made it very clear that this is not a perfect world you're working in or that you can achieve. But Juan Ignacio, as the LATAM representative on this panel for the moment, we talked about informal mining down one end of the table. There is another type of mining, and it's run by organized crime. That's rife across vast parts of Latin America. Are these areas you simply cannot touch?
Look, I think that there's a different perceptions, and I think that we are the ones that need to change that. If we see the mining world 100 years ago versus now, and many people have that image, yeah. I mean, 100 years ago, it was all about taxes and salaries. That was the biggest challenge of the mining companies. Pay your taxes, pay good salaries. Today, what we're talking about is the day-to-day of a mining company. The safety of our people, the access to water, waste management, the access to energy, community engagement, the labor laws, human rights, things that in the past you wouldn't even think about it. Today, this is the standard that is embedded into the formal copper mining of the world, at least International Copper Association's members that are bound to a really strict standard. We created the copper market. We were worried about it. So I think that this is in today's world, this is the standard. We will be rewarded by these standards? I don't know. But I know that this is the minimum standard today for the industry.
Yeah, so putting it into that sort of historical perspective makes a lot of sense. Matthew, I just wonder, we're getting close to having to wrap this up, and we started on the geopolitics of today, and they are very challenging geopolitics, and they're creating, I would say, many waves and ructions within the sorts of work that you're all trying to do. Throw forward 10 years, do you see a brighter vista for the sort of work that all of you are championing, or are we going to have to accept that as this critical minerals explosion continues, you can't have everything?
I'm naturally an optimist, and actually one thing that gives me a lot of optimism, so we have this system at the LME called LME Passport, and that allows producers to voluntarily log the sustainability data, it has to be real, measurable, audited sustainability data associated with their product. And to be clear, right now that's a voluntary thing. As long as they meet the OECD baseline, anything above that is voluntary. We have many hundreds now of disclosures on that platform. And if you look at the trajectory of those disclosures of the underlying work, this is an industry that wants to do the right thing on the whole. And as it continues to do that, we can begin to leave behind a little bit those who don't want to do it. We've talked about delisting LME brands that didn't meet those requirements. Let people go further, hopefully with the help of government as we get into the standards-based markets. Ultimately, I am optimistic, and in 10 years' time, I think we'll be in a better place.
I don't think any of you can not be optimists in the work you do, to be honest. But Isaac, I'm going to finish with you. We talked about Ghana. Yeah. What about the sense of an African mission in terms of this sort of effort? Because there's no point just picking out one country from another in a way. Is there any way that there could be a collaborative effort within the continent of Africa?
Yes, Dave. And I think the continent is catching up because most countries in Africa are changing their laws and kind of following the best international practices. With that in mind, I think we're working towards the right direction. I've had a lot of African countries visiting Ghana to see what we're doing, and I believe that is the right way to go. And even with our tracking system that we deployed, it is such that it can be deployed on the whole continent. So we've started from somewhere, and I'm confident that we will soon catch up.
Well, I know you have lots of support coming from right across this panel here. But can I just thank you all very much indeed for exposing some of the challenges and accepting those, but putting forward a very strong message about how to improve the regulation of this incredibly complex industry. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So if I ask you to leave stage right, if you can, that would be great. I'm just going to move